She made the gate with 4 minutes to spare, still in her scrubs, hospital badge still on her chest. She had been called in at 4 in the morning and never got the chance to go home and change. She was planning to do that when she landed. Seat 2A, first class window. She had barely closed her eyes when the voice came from across the aisle. "Excuse me, sweetheart." The man was mid-50s, expensive suit, Rolex. His wife beside him in designer everything. Both of them looking at Emma's scrubs the way certain people look at things they consider beneath them. "I'm just curious," the man said, loud enough for the rows around him to hear. "How exactly does a nurse afford first class?" His wife laughed. A few people nearby laughed with her. Emma said nothing. She reached up to place her bag in the overhead bin. Her scrub top lifted slightly, and there on her right shoulder blade, dark, precise lines against her skin, was a tattoo. An anchor with the Roman numerals XX at its center. 3 rows back, a man in a dark jacket slowly set his drink down. His jaw went tight. He stood up, and the expression on his face was not anger, it was recognition, the kind that stops a man cold. Before we start, drop a comment telling us where you are watching from today, and if you believe the quietest people are always carrying the most, hit subscribe. Emma Carter had been awake since 3:45. The call came at 4. Trauma case, construction worker, internal bleeding. The kind of situation that does not resolve quickly and does not allow for the luxury of watching the clock. She had stayed until she was certain he was stable, because that was simply who she was, regardless of what she had planned for the morning. She made it home long enough to grab her bag, already packed from the night before, and drove to the airport with her hospital badge still clipped to her scrubs, because stopping to remove it was 4 seconds she did not currently have available. She made the gate with 4 minutes to spare. The gate agent looked at her scrubs and then at her ticket, and then back at her scrubs and said nothing, because the ticket said what it said, and the ticket said 2A. She had been planning to change when she landed. That was the plan. The morning had other ideas. She settled into the window seat with the careful and deliberate movements of someone whose body is running on the specific reserves that only activate when the regular supply has been completely exhausted. She put her bag in the overhead bin, sat down, and looked out the window at the ground crew moving equipment across the tarmac in the gray early morning light. The cabin was quiet in the specific way that early flights are quiet. The collective exhaustion of people who set alarms they did not want to set, pressing down on every row like a shared weight. Emma closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. 1 second of stillness before whatever came next. It was the first stillness she had found since 3:45, and it lasted approximately as long as those things usually last. The voice came from across the aisle before the cabin door had even finished closing. Richard Voss was in his mid-50s, charcoal suit, Rolex on his left wrist. The particular groomed confidence of a man who had been told yes so many times in his professional life that the muscles required to hear no had simply stopped developing from disuse. He was flying to a board meeting he had spent 3 months preparing for, and everything about his posture communicated that the world around him existed primarily as backdrop for that fact. His wife Diana sat beside him, designer jacket, perfect hair, the specific posture of a woman who had learned long ago that her husband's confidence was a boat worth staying in, regardless of where it was sailing. They had noticed Emma the moment she boarded. The scrubs, the badge, the bag that looked like it had been packed in a hurry. Voss leaned toward Diana and said something too low for the rows ahead to catch, but with a smile that was designed to be seen rather than hidden.
Diana laughed. It was the kind of laugh that does not require anything to be funny. It requires only an audience and a target. A woman 2 rows back glanced up from her phone. A businessman in the seat behind Voss smiled without fully committing to it. The small and weightless cruelty of people who mistake Proxima money for permission to behave however they like had found its morning rhythm, and it had found it at Emma's expense before the plane had pushed back from the gate. Emma heard all of it. She turned from the window, looked at Voss for exactly 1 second, with the calm and complete composure of someone who has been in rooms considerably more dangerous than a first-class cabin and has learned that the most powerful response to noise is silence. And then she turned back to the window. She said nothing. She did nothing. She simply existed in her seat with the quiet and unmovable presence of someone who knows exactly who they are, regardless of who is laughing. That was when Voss decided that silence was an invitation to continue. He straightened in his seat, looked around the cabin with the practiced ease of a man who has spent decades performing confidence for audiences, and said it loud enough that the rows immediately surrounding them could hear every word without straining. He asked how a nurse afforded first class. He asked it with a smile. He asked it the way people ask questions when the question is not actually a question, but a statement wearing a question's clothing. Diana laughed again. The woman 2 rows back looked uncomfortable but said nothing. The businessman behind Voss found something interesting to look at on his phone. Emma reached up to place her bag more securely in the overhead bin. The movement was ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of small adjustment that happens 100 times on every flight without anyone noticing or caring.
Except that as she reached up, her scrub top lifted slightly at the back, and for one brief moment, one single unguarded second of fabric and morning light, the tattoo on her right shoulder blade became visible. Dark, precise lines against pale skin, a boat anchor, and at its center, in clean Roman numerals, the number 20. Then she sat back down, and it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. 3 rows back, a man in a dark civilian jacket, who had been sitting with the particular economy of stillness that belongs exclusively to people who have spent careers in environments where stillness was a survival requirement, set his drink down on the tray table. His jaw tightened once. Then he stood up slowly and began walking forward through the cabin, and the expression on his face was not anger, and it was not surprise, and it was not the expression of a man who was going to ask anyone's permission for whatever he was about to do next. Colonel James Harker had been in seat 5A's boarding. Dark jacket, plain shirt, no rank, no insignia, nothing on his person that identified him as the man who had commanded the most classified Marine combat unit of the last 2 decades. He had booked the flight 3 weeks ago for reasons that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with a meeting at the Pentagon that he had been putting off for 6 months and could no longer reasonably avoid. His aide had upgraded the ticket without asking. Harker had not bothered to change it back, because some mornings the small battles feel like one more thing the day does not have room for. He had boarded quietly, taken his seat, ordered water, and begun the specific process of existing in a civilian space that men like him never fully master, regardless of how many years they spend trying. The jacket was right, the shoes were right, everything visible was correct, but the way he occupied a seat, the precise placement of his hands, the eyes that swept the cabin once on boarding and had not stopped since, the absolute economy of every movement he made, told anyone with the training to read it exactly what he was within 30 seconds of looking. Nobody in first class that morning had the training. Nobody except the woman in 2A, who had not looked at him once, and therefore had not needed to. He had seen the tattoo. 1 second. Fabric lifting, morning light, dark precise lines, an anchor, Roman numerals, then gone.
But 1 second was enough for a man who had spent 30 years making critical assessments in fractions of that. He knew the design. He had seen it in a briefing photograph 8 months ago, attached to an after-action report that had not left his desk for 11 days. He knew exactly what the Roman numerals meant. He knew exactly how many of those tattoos existed in the world. He knew that 11 of them were on men who were no longer alive, and he knew that the woman sitting in 2A, in hospital scrubs, with a hospital badge still clipped to her chest, was one of 2 people on Earth who had come back from the mission that made those 11 deaths permanent. The math was simple and devastating. A woman, a nurse, Echo Phantom, the only female operator to complete the full pipeline and serve with the unit through 20 missions in some of the most hostile terrain the last 20 years had produced. He set his drink down. He stood up. He walked forward. He reached the front of the cabin just as Voss was finishing another observation, something about the airline's upgrade policy and the declining standards it apparently reflected, delivered to Diana with the practiced ease of a man who had been performing this particular kind of cruelty for so long it no longer required any conscious effort to produce. The couple behind them had given up, pretending not to listen. Patrick, the flight attendant, was somewhere in the galley making the calculation that experienced flight attendants make when a high-status passenger is behaving badly, the calculation that weighs intervention against consequence and usually finds consequence too heavy to risk. Emma was looking at the window. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her expression had not changed since the first comment. The specific and complete composure of someone who has been in rooms where the stakes were measured in lives rather than seating assignments, and has learned that this kind of noise costs nothing to absorb when you know what expensive actually feels like. Parker stopped beside row 2. He did not look at Voss immediately. He looked at Emma. He stood there for a moment, in the quiet and unhurried way of a man who has never once needed speed to establish presence.
Then he said it one word, barely above a whisper, quiet enough that only Emma could hear it clearly. Echo Phantom. The effect on Emma was immediate and invisible simultaneously. Nothing moved on her face, nothing shifted in her posture, but something behind her eyes changed, the way a room changes when a door opens somewhat deep inside a building. Not dramatically, Just a subtle shift in pressure that tells you the architecture goes further than you thought. She looked at him. He held her gaze for a moment, confirming what he already knew. And then he turned to Voss. If you have ever watched someone finally face the weight of their own words, drop the word justice in the comments right now. Because what was about to happen to Richard Voss in that first-class cabin was the specific and unhurried kind of justice that does not announce itself until it is already standing right in front of you. Harker looked at Voss with the expression of a man who has assessed considerably more serious threats than a businessman in a charcoal suit, and has never once found the experience particularly challenging. He did not introduce himself. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood in the aisle with the complete and unmovable authority of someone for whom authority is not a performance, but a permanent condition, and said, "I think you owe this woman an apology." His voice was the specific quiet that carries further than shouting, because it contains none of the desperation that shouting requires. Voss blinked. He looked Harker up and down with the evaluating gaze of a man trying to place someone in a hierarchy he understands, and finding that the categories available to him are not producing a useful result. He laughed. The laugh was slightly less certain than his earlier ones. "And who exactly are you?" he asked. Harker reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed his phone. He held it in his hand without unlocking it. He looked at Voss with the patient and absolute calm of a man who has made decisions under conditions that made this conversation look like a children's disagreement, and said, "Someone who makes one call and this plane goes back to the gate." The words landed in the cabin the way important things land when they are said by the right person at the right volume. Not dramatically, just completely.
Patrick appeared at the galley curtain, frozen mid-step. The woman 2 rows back looked up from her phone and did not look back down. Diana's hand found her husband's arm with the specific grip of a woman who has just felt the ground shift beneath something she thought was solid. Voss looked at the phone, then at Harker's face. The board meeting was 4 hours away, 3 months of preparation. 14 people flying in from 4 different cities for a conversation that could not be rescheduled without consequences he did not want to think about in any detail. He looked at the phone again, then at Emma sitting quietly in 2A, with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes on the window, and 11 months of something he would never understand written into the way she held herself. He looked back at Harker, and Richard Voss, a man who had not genuinely backed down from anything in his professional life in longer than he could accurately remember, felt the specific and unfamiliar sensation of having run out of ground to stand on. Voss broke in under 4 seconds, not because he was a coward in the conventional sense. He had built a company from nothing, and that required a specific kind of nerve that most people never develop. He broke because the man standing in the aisle beside him had the specific quality of stillness that tells you at some level below conscious thought that every word he has said has been completely true, and that the consequences of testing that truth are not consequences you want to find out about at 7 in the morning, 4 hours before the most important meeting of your professional quarter. He looked at the phone one more time, then he looked at Emma. Then he cleared his throat in the specific way that men clear their throats when they are about to do something their ego has not fully agreed to yet. "I apologize," he said. He was looking at Harker when he said it. Harker did not move, did not acknowledge it, did not give Voss the relief of a nod or any other signal that the apology had landed somewhere useful. His eyes remained on Voss's face with the patient and complete stillness of a man waiting for the correct version of something to be delivered rather than the convenient one. Voss understood. He turned to Emma. The entire first-class cabin was watching now, with the specific and total attention that people give to moments they understand they will be describing to other people later.
Patrick had not moved from the galley curtain. The woman 2 rows back had put her phone face down on her tray table. The businessman behind Voss had closed his laptop. Every available set of eyes in the forward cabin was on the man in the charcoal suit, who had spent the last 20 minutes performing confidence for an audience that was now watching him do something considerably less comfortable. "I apologize," Voss said to Emma. The words cost him something visible, not money, something more expensive than money. The specific currency of a man who has confused his net worth with his personal worth for long enough that separating the two in public felt like a form of undressing. Diana said it too. She turned back to the window. She said nothing else. She did not need to. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. You could feel it against your skin. Voss sat back in his seat and opened his laptop with the careful movements of a man trying to look like he is transitioning back to normal when normal is no longer a place he can fully access. Diana put her headphones in. The businessman behind them found his phone again. The ordinary machinery of a first-class cabin in the minutes before departure slowly reassembled itself around the extraordinary thing that had just happened inside it. But the reassembly was not complete, and everyone present knew it.
because Harker was still standing in the aisle, and he had not put his phone away, and his eyes had moved from Voss to Emma with an expression that belonged to a different conversation entirely, one that had nothing to do with seat assignments or apologies, one that had been waiting 8 months for a moment, and had just found one in the last place either party would have expected. He sat down in 2B, the empty seat beside Emma. He did not ask permission. He simply sat with the ease of a man for whom asking permission has always been less relevant than making the right decision and living with it completely. He placed his phone face down on his knee and looked at Emma's profile for a moment. The tired eyes, the hair still loose from the night shift, the badge still on her chest, the thin black paracord bracelet on her left wrist with 11 small steel beads pressed against her skin. He had known about the bracelet from the after-action report, 1 bead for each teammate lost. He had read that detail in a footnote on page 9, and had not been able to stop thinking about it for 8 months. Seeing it in person was different from reading about it, in the specific way that everything real is different from every description of it. Echo Phantom completed 27 missions, he said quietly, not to fill the silence, because it needed to be said out loud by someone who understood what that number meant. No failures, not one. In 15 years of classified operations in theaters that most people in this country will never know existed. He paused. The final mission was not a failure either. The objective was secured. The intelligence was extracted. Another pause. Longer this time. The cost was something I have been accounting for every day since.
Emma listened to all of it, without moving, without looking at him. Her hands remained folded in her lap, with the bracelet against her left wrist, and the 11 beads pressing into her skin the way they always pressed. Quietly, constantly, specifically. Each one a name she carried, because carrying them was the only form of presence she could still offer the people those names had belonged to. She told him about Danny Reyes. Not everything, just the essential shape of it. His name in a veteran care update, the ticket bought without explanation, the hospital in Bethesda, the visit he did not know was coming. Harker listened the way men listen when they are hearing something they need rather than something they were expecting. When she finished, he reached in the inside pocket of his jacket and removed something she had not anticipated. A photograph. Small, worn soft at the edges from months of daily contact with the fabric of a jacket pocket. 13 faces in desert gear, somewhere that did not appear on any public map. He placed it on her tray table without a word, and watched her look at it, and did not say anything, because the moment did not need words, and he had learned long ago that the moments that do not need words are the ones you protect by keeping silent. Emma looked at the photograph for a long time, at the 11 faces that were no longer faces she could call, at the 2 that were, at her own face among them, younger, harder, carrying a different kind of weight than the weight she carried now. Then she looked up at Harker and asked him the question she had been tarrying since the night the world reduced itself to 2 survivors and 11 names. "Did you know," she said quietly, "that we wouldn't all come back?" Harker answered her honestly, not the version of honest that keeps the difficult parts back and presents the acceptable remainder as the whole truth. The complete version, the one that had been living inside him for 8 months without anywhere to go. He told her about the intelligence assessment, the 60-40 probability of full extraction. He told her that 60-40 was within operational parameters for a mission of that classification level and strategic importance, and that he had looked at those parameters every single day since the after-action report crossed his desk, and that the math had not gotten easier to carry a single time in all those days, regardless of how many times he ran it.
He told her that he had read the full report, all of it, every page, every footnote. The page that described what she had done inside that building when everything fell apart, and the options reduced themselves to one. The page that described the extraction, the weight she had carried, the distance, the conditions. He had read that page more times than any other, and he had never once finished it without sitting quietly for several minutes afterward, doing nothing at all. Emma listened to all of it without interrupting. Her hands remained in her lap, the bracelet against her left wrist, the 11 beads.
She had the specific quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned to receive difficult things without either deflecting them or collapsing under them. The stillness of someone who has processed enough genuine weight to know that the only way through something heavy is to let it land completely, rather than catching it at arm's length. When Harker finished, she was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the DC suburbs were visible below, through a thin layer of cloud. The geometry of roads and rooftops, and ordinary life continuing its existence beneath the plane, with no knowledge of the conversation happening 30,000 feet above it. Emma looked at the photograph, still on her tray table, at the 13 faces, at the 11 who were gone. She told him something then that she had not told anyone since leaving the Marines. Not her supervisor at the hospital, not the therapist she had seen for 3 months before deciding the appointments were taking more than they were giving. She told him that the hardest part was not the mission itself, the mission she had trained for, the mission her body and her mind and her 11 years of accumulated experience had prepared her for, in ways she could not have articulated, but that had been available when she needed them completely. The hardest part was the morning after waking up in the medical facility in Germany, with Danny Reyes 2 beds away, and 11 empty beds where the rest of them should have been, and understanding for the first time in a sustained and unavoidable way that the number was permanent. That it was not going to change overnight, or with time, or with any effort she could make. 11 was the number, and 11 was going to remain the number for the rest of her life, and the only thing she could do with that was decide what to carry it as. Parker reached into his jacket pocket again. Not for the photograph this time, for something smaller. A folded piece of paper, official letterhead, the specific cream-colored stock of Pentagon correspondence. He placed it on the tray table beside the photograph. Emma looked at it without unfolding it. He told her what it contained. Echo Phantom's classified service record was currently under formal review for official recognition. The process had been moving slowly, for the specific bureaucratic reasons that slow things always move slowly for. Classification levels, interagency coordination, the careful legal architecture required to acknowledge the existence of something that had officially never existed. But it was moving. The 11 names on her bracelet were going to be spoken out loud in a room with the right people before the end of the year. Spoken on the record, permanently. The 2 names still living were going to be in that room when it happened. He looked at her wrist, at the beads. They deserve to be remembered properly, he said. Emma looked at the bracelet for a long moment. Then she said the thing that made Harker go quiet for the rest of the flight. They already are, she said softly. I make sure of it, every day. Harker returned to 5A before the descent began. He folded the photograph back into his pocket and stood and looked at Emma for a moment, with the expression of a man who came onto a plane that morning carrying something heavy and is leaving the conversation slightly differently arranged than he arrived at it. Not lighter, exactly, but differently balanced. The way weight shifts when it is finally shared with someone who can hold their portion of it without needing to be protected from it. He said one more thing before he left. He told her that what she did inside that building, what she carried out of it, was something that a very small number of people in the history of the program had ever been required to do, and that an even smaller number had managed. He did not say it as a compliment. He said it as a fact, delivered by someone who understood facts of that category completely. Emma nodded once and turned back to the window, and that was the end of the conversation between them for the remainder of the flight. She landed in D.C. at 11:40, took a cab directly to Bethesda Naval Hospital, walked through the entrance in her scrubs with her bag over one shoulder and her badge still on her chest because she still had not changed. And at this point, the scrubs were simply what she was wearing, and she had stopped thinking about it somewhere over Virginia. She asked at the front desk for Staff Sergeant Daniel Reyes, room 414. The woman at the desk looked at her scrubs and her badge and gave her the room number without any further questions, because a nurse asking for a patient's room number at a military hospital is not a thing that requires explanation. She took the elevator. 4th floor, long corridor, the specific antiseptic smell of a hospital that never quite disappears regardless of what else is present in the air. She walked the corridor, counting room numbers, and stopped outside 414, and stood there with her hand not quite touching the door, and everything the morning had given her. The flight and the mockery and Harker, and the photograph and the letter,
and 30,000 feet of honest conversation about things she had been carrying alone for 8 months, pressing against the inside of her chest in the specific way that things press when they have finally found the right moment to arrive somewhere. She knocked. A voice said, "Come in." She opened the door. Danny Reyes was sitting up in the hospital bed, thinner than she remembered, left arm in a brace, his face carrying the specific geography of someone who had been through something that had rearranged their features slightly, in ways that were permanent and visible if you knew what you were looking at. He looked at the door. He looked at Emma. He was quiet for a long moment, in the specific way that people who have been through the same thing are quiet when they see each other. Not from discomfort, but from the particular fullness of a moment that does not immediately have room for words. Then he looked at her wrist, at the bracelet, at the 11 beads. He looked at his own wrist, where the same paracord sat against the same skin, with the same 11 beads worn smooth from the same 8 months of daily contact. He looked back at her face, and Danny Reyes, Staff Sergeant Echo Phantom, one of 2, smiled, the first real smile Emma had seen on a face she recognized since the morning she woke up in Germany and understood what permanent meant. "I wondered when you'd show up," he said. She sat in the chair beside his bed, and they talked for 4 hours about nothing important and everything that mattered. And outside the window, the DC afternoon did what October afternoons do, came in low and golden and unhurried, across a city that did not know and did not need to know what was happening in room 414 of Bethesda Naval Hospital, between 2 people and 2 identical bracelets and 22 steel beads that together accounted for everyone Echo Phantom had ever been. If this story reminded you that the people carrying the most are almost always the ones saying the least, subscribe and stay with us, because every single week we bring you another story about the quiet ones and they make every single day. And those are exactly the stories that should never be forgotten.